To our lecture on lecture GAD 1104. Remember the last time we met on Zoom and had quite a difficulty. We wanted to do a recap of what we covered. We're looking at gender relations, particularly looking at what gender relations are, but also how gender relations manifest. And in our conversation, which most of you were part of, we looked at gender relations manifesting in four forms. Gender relations as power relations. We looked at gender relations as symbolic relations. Gender relations as emotional relations, and also gender relations as production relations. And we were looking at all these concepts, trying to understand how relations between and amongst women manifest, between and amongst women and men manifest in different forms. And within the gender power relations, we looked at power differentials amongst women and amongst men, and particularly looked at, for instance, relations around decision making, whether it is in the family or institutions such as education institutions or the state. But when you look at who does which decision, you're looking particularly at power relations. If you look at what resources we are able to access as women and men, whether it is in the family or other spaces, you're looking at power relations. If you look at decisions around ownership of property, all those come under power relations. And then we moved to looking at production relations, and in here we particularly noted that production relations enable us to understand the kind of roles that women and men perform within a given society. Here, what we did, we illustrated production relations by looking closely at our state institutions, government, and our illustration was particularly from the public service. If you look at different ministries that we have in Uganda and look at people who are employed there, we've had a study in Makerere University tracing the location of men and women in different government institutions, and we started from top positions, director, commissioners, going down to the lower cadre, who included drivers, secretarial staff, people who run around. And we noted, we actually found an interesting image in which women occupied a lower position that was almost parallel to men who were occupying higher positions of decision making. And so we noted that this could be a manifestation of the inequality that we have within the public sector, public service as an institution. But if you also looked at other institutions like the family, you could be able to tell where are women located, where are men located in terms of the kinds of roles that are done in that institution. Who does what? Who performs which activity in that community, in that family as an institution, in that school, who occupies which role? That also enables you to look at understanding the relations. What we noted when we looked at the public service is that these statistics point to male domination within the public service, And we noted that if you want to understand gender relations which manifest as production relations, there are pretty simple questions you need to ask yourself. For instance, who performs which task, in what sphere? Sometimes you meet men operating in a particular dominant sphere, like the public sphere, and then women in the domestic sphere, although they are crossovers from both sexes. So you need to ask who performs which task, in which field, with what value. You might be men and women employed in the same company, at the same position, but some people's contribution is understood and valued more than others. It is paid highly than the others. So when you ask these questions, you are able to understand how relations between men and women play out in such kind of space. Then we looked at symbolic relations, and in here we noted that quite often men and women are culturally constructed and represented through symbols. If you look at the language that we use in our communities, we tend to associate men and women with particular symbols. We speak about them as if they were particular objects we want to liken them to. And this symbolic representation comes strongly through language. If you look at the proverbs that we have down there in our communities, the common sayings, there is a tendency to associate men with symbols of power, of control, and of dominance. For instance, we have cultures who look at men as king of the jungle. We look at other cultures that associate women with donkeys. They will tell you women are donkeys. And that is not necessarily to say that women are animals, but rather there's a move to associate the kind of things that women do, the workloads, the investedness in the domestic sphere, with the kind of, the donkey and the activities that the donkey does. We have also had, centrally here in Uganda, in Buganda, men being referred to as mivule, Basaja mivule. We have heard that. Not necessarily to say that, men are trees, because muvule is a tree, strongest, durable, very costly in the tropics, in the tropical forests. And so when you have men who are characterized as such, you tend to see the kind of symbolic meaning that is associated with men. And the meaning comes around strength, around their physical appearance, around the domination that comes with that. So we noted that when you have certain relations of gender coming through symbols and the meanings that are attached to these, we're looking at another form of gender relations. And the other last one that we looked at was emotional relations, where we looked at those social stereotypes that categorize men and women alongside the characteristics they express, the kind of emotional feelings derived from one's circumstance or mood or relationships. And you tend to look at the kind of attachments that men have or women have in particular. For instance, if you looked at the household as a unit, the attachment they have on particular things in the household, on their roles, on the spaces they inhabit within the domestic sphere. But also you meet casual descriptions of how women are emotional and men are less emotional. So we noted that if you wanted to understand gender relations in detail, you do not necessarily need to look at gender as about women on one side and men on the other. That you need to have this deeper understanding of how gender relations manifest in different forms, as power relations, as symbolic, emotional, and also as production relations. We noted that understanding gender relations as this gives you a broader shift. It gives you a shift from merely looking at these definitions of gender, which relate gender to women, women's relationship to men, simply as that, but rather to start looking at how groups of people can be gendered, how spaces can be gendered, but also how institutions, social institutions, like schools, religion, the state, media, the family, how those could also be gendered institutions. So we noted that for us to be able to understand these gender relations, you need to do a gender analysis. And when you're doing a gender analysis, then you're using the other, questions that we were talking about. You need to ask yourself a set of questions to be able to arrive at, those different relations. I want to first draw a simple illustration here. If this was our society here, and you want to analyze gender relations within this society, sometimes we start by looking at if we had, women and men and boys and girls in this society, then you ask yourself who does what? The kind of roles that people do. And sometimes you might find men and women doing similar roles. At other times you will find differences in terms of the roles that people do. What kind of resources that people access, utilize, and control. Resources. This will also enable you to understand how men and women relate with regard to resources. For instance, if you pick up any ordinary family in any of the communities where you come from, who has access to, let's say, land as a resource? Who accesses land? Who uses it? That land where your home is seated, if we were to look for the land title, whose name is on that title between the male and the female? And this will enable you to understand, part of the relations. We look at the rules, and these could be formal or informal rules. And we ask what kind of rules guide the behavior, the relations, and the interactions between these people. You come to the university, and then somehow you find unstated rules, expectations of being a university student. So as a university student, what kind of rules guide your existence at the university? And sometimes the rules and expectations and the assumptions that are held about male students, sometimes they differ from female students. We could also look at the kinds of, we can look at activities. We have seen who does what, we have seen rules, we have seen resources. We can also look at power as the other aspect of understanding gender relations. And in here you can ask yourself who makes which decision, whether in the family or the school or any other institutional space. So basically, when you analyze this, you realize that these will either be relations of equality or inequality. And that is basically what we wanted to demonstrate. We want to stop there.